Welcome back. Let's practice identifying the parts of variable expressions. All right, so here's our first example. We want to identify the variable and constant terms of the variable expression. For each variable term, identify the coefficient and variable parts. All right, so our variable expression here is 4x squared plus 2x minus 1. This variable expression has three different terms. We have 4x squared, 2x, and negative 1. All right. Terms of a variable expression will always be separated by plus and minus signs. Now, for those three terms, we want to identify which of them are variable terms and which of them are constant terms. And the way you can tell the difference is if the term includes a variable or not. And by a variable, I mean a letter such as x. Okay, so looking at this variable expression, we can clearly see that there are two variable terms and one constant term. 4x squared includes a variable of x, and 2x includes a variable of x. This last term here of negative 1 is just negative 1. There's no x or any other variables to be seen. So let's write this down. Our variable terms are 4x squared and 2x, and our constant term is negative 1. Don't forget about that negative sign that is included with that 1. All right, so the constant term is not just 1, it is negative 1. All right, so now we've identified the variable and constant terms of our variable expression, but now for each variable term, we want to identify the coefficient and variable parts. And so here's what that means. The coefficient of a variable term is simply the number in front of any variables. All right, so for 4x squared, the coefficient is 4. All right, it's the number in front of any variable part, which in this case would be x squared. Okay, it doesn't matter that x is being squared, that would be the variable part of that variable term. All right, so the coefficient is 4 and the variable part is x squared. Now for 2x, the coefficient would be 2, right? 2 is the number in front of the variable part, which in this case is just x. All right, for that term, the coefficient is 2 and the variable part is x. And that's it. We have now successfully identified all the variable and constant terms of our variable expression, and we identified the coefficients and variable parts of each of our variable terms. Let's take a look at another example. Here we once again want to identify the variable and constant terms of the variable expression, and for each variable term we want to identify the coefficient and variable parts. Okay, so for this variable expression, we have 1, 2, 3, 4 different terms. They are 8, negative y to the power of 4, positive 3y, and positive x. Now, looking at these four terms, which of them are variable terms and which of them are constant terms? Well, there's only one term that doesn't include a letter or a variable, right? 8 is the only term that doesn't have a letter in it. All the other three terms either have a y or an x. It doesn't matter which letter they are, both of them, x and y, are variables, and so therefore those three terms would be variable terms. All right, so our constant term in this case is 8, and our variable terms are negative y to the power of 4, 3y, and x. Okay, and just like with our previous example, don't forget to include any negative signs. The variable term is negative y to the power of 4, not just y to the power of 4. Okay, so make sure to include that negative. Now, we've identified the variable and constant terms. Now let's identify the parts of each variable term. We need to identify the coefficient and variable part in each case. Starting with negative y to the power of 4, what would the coefficient of that term be? It seems a little bit difficult at first because we don't explicitly see a number, right? We just see negative y to the power of 4. But something to know about variable terms is that when the coefficient is 1 or negative 1, we don't write the number 1 in front of the variable. All right, so we don't write negative 1 times y or 1 times y, we simply write negative y or just y. All right, if you don't see a number in front of a variable, the coefficient is always 1. So, keeping that in mind here, we have negative y to the power of 4. That must mean that the coefficient is negative 1. So we'll write down negative 1 for the coefficient, and then the variable part would be everything else. In this case, it would be y to the power of 4. All right, so that is the variable part of that variable term. Now moving on to 3y, this time the coefficient is easier to see. We can see that it is 3 because 3 is in front of y. So the coefficient is 3, and then the variable part would just be y. All right, and then finally, for our last variable term, we have x. And so just like we got done talking about, when looking for the coefficient and you don't see any number in front of that variable, it must mean that the coefficient is 1. Unless there's a negative sign there, then of course it's a negative 1, but in this case there is no negative sign, so the coefficient is 1. So we'll write down 1, and then of course the variable part would just be x. It is the part of our variable term that includes a variable. Okay, and so now we are finished. We have identified all of our variable and constant terms, as well as identified the parts of our variable terms. Let's take a look at another example. We once again want to identify the variable and constant terms of the variable expression, and for each of the variable terms that we identify, we also want to identify the coefficient and variable parts. Okay, so our variable expression this time is negative 5n minus 18 plus 2n cubed, or 2n to the power of 3. And so for this variable expression, there are 3 terms, right? Negative 5n, negative 18, and positive 2n cubed. And so for those 3 terms of our variable expression, which of them are constant terms and which of them are variable terms? And well, it looks like there are 2 variable terms, right? There are 2 terms that include a letter, which would be a variable. In this case, the letter being used is n. It doesn't matter what letter is being used. If you see a letter in an expression like this, that is a variable, all right? So negative 5n and 2n cubed would be our 2 variable terms. And so then negative 18, of course, would be our constant term because it doesn't have any variables. All right, so our constant term is negative 18. Don't forget to include the negative sign. That is important. That negative is attached to 18, so it is negative 18. And then our 2 variable terms are negative 5n and 2n cubed. Okay, so now we've identified our variable and constant terms. Let's work on identifying the parts of our variable terms next. And so starting with negative 5n, the coefficient, or the number out front of the variable, is negative 5. All right, so our coefficient is negative 5, which means that our variable part must be just n. Okay, that is the part of the variable term that involves a variable. Now for the other variable term, we have 2n cubed. The coefficient would be 2 because the 2 is in front of the variable. It doesn't matter that that variable is raised to the power of 3. 2 is still the number in front of that variable part. Okay, so the coefficient is 2, and the variable part would be the n cubed. And be sure to not just write n, you do want to include that power of 3. All right, the full variable term is n cubed. Hey there, real quick, before we take a look at the next example, if you find my tutorial videos here at JK Math to be helpful, then I'd like to invite you to join my membership site, JK Math Plus, where you get access to many perks, including bonus content and my exclusive community. The bonus content includes dark mode versions of my videos, extra example problems, and more, while the community is a private space online where you can post questions, have discussions, and study together with me and other members. To learn how to join and see a full list of everything you get access to as a member, you can head over to jkmathematics.com/plus. I'll have a link for that in the description of this video. So if you are interested in becoming a member, feel free to check that out. It's a great way to support me and the tutorials I make, as well as a great way for you to learn math better. But for now, let's take a look at the next example. Next up, we want to identify the variable and constant terms of the variable expression that we have right here. And for each variable term, we want to identify the coefficient and variable parts. All right, so our variable expression is a to the power of 5 minus 2 times b squared plus 9 times a times b minus 7 times b. All right, so in this variable expression, I see 4 terms, right? 1, 2, 3, 4. And so looking at those 4 terms, which of them are variable terms and which of them are constant terms? And well, it doesn't look like there are any constant terms, right? Each and every one of these terms includes a letter or a variable. A to the power 5 has a variable of a, negative 2b squared has a variable of b, 9ab has 2 variables, we have both a and b, and negative 7b also has a variable of b. And so for this variable expression, we can pretty confidently say that there are no constant terms. All of the terms of this variable expression are variable terms. So I'll write down that there are 0 constant terms, but then for the variable terms, we just want to write down all 4 of these terms. We have a to the power of 5, then negative 2b squared, 9ab, and negative 7b. And now, for each of these variable terms, what we want to do is identify the coefficient and variable part. And for the first term here, it looks like it doesn't have a coefficient, right? It's just a to the power of 5. But as we discussed in a previous example, when you don't see a number in front of a variable, that means the coefficient is 1. All right, so the coefficient is 1, which means that the variable part is a to the power of 5. All right, that is the part of the term that involves a variable. For the next term, we have negative 2b squared. Negative 2 is the number out front, so that is the coefficient. It's negative 2, which means that b squared is the variable part. So I'll write down b squared. All right, then moving on to the next term, we have 9ab. The coefficient, or the number out front, is 9. So I'll write down 9. And then for the variable part, it would be ab. Make sure to include both of those variables. All right, it doesn't matter that there's more than one variable within that variable term. Both a and b are variables, and so they are both included in the variable part of that variable term. All right, so the variable part is a times b. And then finally, we have negative 7b. The coefficient, or the number out front, is negative 7. So I'll write down negative 7, and then the variable part would just be b. Okay, and so with that, we have now completed this example. Let's take a look at one more example for this video. Okay, so for our last example, one more time we want to identify the variable and constant terms of the variable expression, and for each variable term we want to identify the coefficient and variable parts. And we have a very big variable expression this time. It is 12x squared y squared plus x squared y minus 4xy squared minus xy plus 5x minus 6y plus 20. And so counting the terms of this variable expression, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There are a total of 7 terms in this variable expression, but how many of them are variable terms and how many are constant terms? Well, in this case, it looks like all of them are variable terms except for one, right? This term on the end here, plus 20, is the only term that doesn't include a letter. All of the others have an x or a y within them. So positive 20, or just 20, is our constant term, which means that the other 6 terms must be our variable terms. So let's write all those down. We have 12 times x squared times y squared, and then x squared times y, and then negative 4x y squared, and then negative x times y, 5x, and negative 6y. All right, I just wrote down each of the variable terms that we can see right here in our variable expression. Okay, and once again, be sure to include all those negative signs. There are a lot of them this time. There was one here, and one here. So make sure to include them with the term that goes after them, right? So this negative goes to this term. So we have negative 4x times y squared, And similarly, this negative goes to this term, so we have negative x times y, and this negative goes to this term, so we have negative 6y. Okay, so now let's identify the coefficient and variable part of each of these variable terms. For the first one, the coefficient, or the number out front, is 12. We have 12 in front of x squared times y squared. So the coefficient is 12, which means that the variable part would be x squared times y squared. All right, it's not just x squared or not just y squared. It's both of those two parts together. All right, everything but 12 is the variable part because they involve variables or letters, x and y. All right, now moving on to the next variable term, we have x squared times y. There's no number in front of those variables, so we can assume that the coefficient is 1, as we've discussed in previous examples. So the coefficient is 1, and then x squared times y would be the variable part. So I'll write x squared times y. Then for the next term, we have negative 4x y squared. The coefficient, or the number out front, is negative 4. So I'll write down negative 4, and the variable part would be x times y squared, since that is the part of the term that involves variables. So we have x times y squared. And then moving on to the next term, we have negative x times y. The coefficient of this term, it looks like it would just be a negative sign, but remember, when you don't see a number, that means the coefficient is 1, or in this case, because there's a negative sign, the coefficient is negative 1. So the coefficient is negative 1, and so the variable part is x times y, the rest of that term. Moving on to our next term, we have 5x. The coefficient is clearly 5. It is the number in front of the letters, or in this case, the only letter, which is our variable of x. So we have a coefficient of 5 and a variable part of x. And then finally, for our last variable term, we have negative 6y. Negative 6 is the number out front, so that is the coefficient. So we'll write down negative 6, and so then the variable part is just y. Okay, and with that, we have now gone through all of our variable terms and identified the coefficient and variable parts. And so with that, we have now completed this example, and this was also the last example for this video. However, if you do want to get some more practice with variable expressions, I do have more examples on my membership site. So if that's something that interests you, feel free to look into becoming a member. You can get more details on my website at jkmathematics.com/plus. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comments. But if you don't have any questions, this is all I had for now. So I will see you next time.